Ladies and gentlemen, I want to dive into a subject that affects so many of us: relationships. Specifically, relationships where one person craves the other, yet silence persists. Now, we all know the power of words. We use them to express ourselves, to make connections, to influence. But what about when words don't come? What about when the person you're interested in, the one you desire, the one you crave, remains silent? Here's the truth. Silence doesn't always mean what you think it means. Silence is often seen as something negative in the realm of relationships. When someone is silent, especially in the face of emotion, confusion can set in. Why aren't they speaking? Why aren't they opening up? When we can feel the desire, the craving, the connection. But the truth is, silence can be incredibly powerful and can reveal more than any spoken words. We live in a world that is obsessed with communication, texts, calls, social media updates. Everywhere we turn, people are sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their opinions. The idea of silence seems foreign, uncomfortable even. We're so used to the noise that we've forgotten how to listen to what silence actually says. The first thing to realize is that silence is not inherently a bad thing. We need to redefine how we view silence in relationships. In fact, silence can be a very conscious choice, not necessarily a sign of disconnection. It can be a pause for reflection, a necessary space to process emotions or thoughts that are too complex or intense to articulate at the moment. In relationships, especially those that are deep and meaningful, silence often arises from a place of thoughtfulness and, yes, even vulnerability. When someone craves you, feels deeply connected to you, and has an emotional pull toward you, there's a moment where the intensity of those emotions might overwhelm their ability to express them. Sometimes the person is not sure how to convey the depth of what they're feeling, and so they stay silent, hoping that silence itself might communicate something. Maybe they hope the other person will recognize the unspoken words or sense the emotions that remain beneath the surface. This can happen in many ways. Imagine someone is feeling a strong emotional draw toward you, but they are unsure whether you feel the same way. The risk of rejection is high. They might fear that if they speak too soon, their emotions will be dismissed or misunderstood. This fear of vulnerability is one of the most common reasons people choose silence over speech. In these moments, the silence can be a way of protecting themselves from emotional harm, even though it comes from a place of deep yearning. The person may crave you deeply, yet the fear of being hurt prevents them from expressing it. There's also the possibility that someone is working through their own internal struggles that have nothing to do with you. They may crave you, but their silence is not an indication of disinterest. It could be that they are dealing with their own issues, perhaps emotional baggage from past relationships, fears about commitment, or even worries about their own ability to give you the kind of connection you deserve. When someone is working through personal challenges, sometimes the best way they know how to cope is by retreating into silence, attempting to resolve their own thoughts before bringing them into the relationship. They want to make sure that when they do speak, their words are clear, considered, and don't unintentionally hurt the other person. In many cases, silence can also be a form of respect. When someone is craving you but remains silent, it can be a sign that they are respecting the space you need. They might sense that you aren't yet ready to open up or reciprocate the feelings they have for you. So out of consideration, they hold back. It's not that they've stopped caring. In fact, they might care more than you realize. They might recognize that by staying silent, they are giving you the room to process your own feelings and come to your own conclusions. Silence here can be an act of patience, waiting for the other person to feel safe enough to respond or reciprocate. Another aspect to consider is the role of social conditioning. Many people, especially men, have been socialized to keep their emotions in check, to not show vulnerability, or to not be the one to express too much. In some cultures, silence is seen as a form of strength, and opening up about one's emotional desires is sometimes seen as a weakness. If someone is craving you but is silent, they may simply not have the tools or the learned behavior to express their emotions openly. They might fear being seen as too needy or weak, so they keep their feelings locked away, even though internally they crave the connection. In these instances, silence doesn't mean the end of the relationship or a lack of affection. It means the person is still processing, still uncertain, still trying to make sense of their emotion. This is where the real work of communication comes into play. If you're on the receiving end of this silence, it's crucial to avoid jumping to conclusions and to give space for the other person's process. Silence, when approached with understanding, can allow both individuals to clear the mental clutter, to reflect, and to come together when the time is right. At the same time, it's important to recognize that silence can also be a reflection of a lack of confidence in expressing emotions. People who crave others but remain silent may simply lack the skills or experience in communicating openly about their desires. Their silence might be less about processing emotions and more about their internal struggle with vulnerability. They might not know how to share what they're feeling because they've never been taught how to do so in a healthy, constructive way. And then there's the aspect of control. Sometimes silence can be a strategy. If someone is craving you but choosing to remain silent, they might be trying to control the situation, trying to see how much you're willing to invest or whether you'll initiate the conversation. They might believe that by staying silent, they will somehow make you more interested or more motivated to act. While this can be a tactic used by some, it's important to recognize that this type of silence is less about emotional depth and more about playing a game. It's a dangerous game, one that can lead to frustration and miscommunication if not handled carefully. Ultimately, silence is not a one-size-fits-all explanation. It's a dynamic force in relationships, and when someone craves you but is silent, it often speaks volumes. It's not just a passive absence of words. It's filled with meaning, with emotions, with vulnerability. And if you're in a situation where someone is silent, don't rush to conclusions. Instead, listen deeply, not just to the silence itself, but to the unspoken messages that lie beneath it. Craving someone is one of the most powerful emotions we can feel. It's a force that can overwhelm us, leaving us yearning for connection, for closeness, and for intimacy. But here's the paradox. Craving doesn't always translate into action. The deep emotional desire to be with someone doesn't always lead to the physical expression of those feelings. In fact, the opposite can often happen. The stronger the craving, the more intense the emotional energy, the more paralyzed we can become in our actions. Understanding this gap between emotion and action is key to understanding why someone might crave you but remain silent or distant. Craving is an emotional state, a deeply rooted, almost visceral longing for another person. But emotions, while intense, are often not enough to push someone into action. Why is this the case? The answer lies in the complexity of human psychology and behavior. Emotions, especially those that are strong, can create internal conflict. On one hand, the craving for someone can be so powerful that it feels all-consuming. On the other hand, the fear of rejection, vulnerability, or even the consequences of acting on that craving can create a barrier. This internal tug-of-war is something that many people experience, even though it's not always visible on the surface. This gap between emotion and action can be explained in part by the difference between emotional and cognitive processing. Emotions often arise spontaneously, driven by our subconscious mind, while actions are the result of more conscious thought and decision-making. When someone craves another person, they may feel an immediate emotional surge, but that doesn't automatically mean that their conscious mind will support the action that follows. In fact, the stronger the craving, the more intense the emotions can become. And this can lead to a sense of being overwhelmed. When emotions are high, our ability to think rationally or clearly is often diminished. This is when people tend to hesitate, hold back, or remain silent. Moreover, the fear of making a mistake or misinterpreting the other person's feelings can paralyze someone from acting. If someone craves you but doesn't know how you feel, they might be caught in a cycle of doubt and insecurity. What if you don't feel the same way? What if expressing their emotions causes discomfort or ruins the dynamic of the relationship? These questions can lead to hesitation, self-doubt, and ultimately inaction. The craving is still there, burning inside, but it is countered by the fear of stepping forward and being rejected or misunderstood. Another powerful factor that prevents someone from acting on their craving is the fear of vulnerability. Craving someone isn't just about wanting them physically, it's about wanting them emotionally, mentally, and in a deeper, more intimate way. But intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability can be terrifying. The person who craves you might fear that in opening up, they will expose themselves in ways they're not ready for. They might fear that in showing you their true feelings, they will lose control over how they are perceived. Vulnerability requires trust, and not everyone is prepared to give that trust, especially when the emotions involved are so strong and uncertain. The craving might be undeniable, but the vulnerability required to act on it feels like too great of a risk. This fear of vulnerability is especially prevalent in people who have experienced past hurts. If someone has been rejected, hurt, or betrayed in the past, that emotional scar can make it even harder to act on their current feelings. The craving for you might bring back memories of previous pain, and as a result, they might hold back, not wanting to face the potential of that pain again. They crave connection, but they are terrified of the consequences that might follow, so they remain silent, unsure of how to proceed. Furthermore, there's the issue of self-esteem and personal worth. If someone's self-esteem is low, even the act of craving someone can bring up feelings of inadequacy. They might not believe they deserve your affection, attention, or love, even if they desire it deeply. In this case, the craving itself becomes a source of inner conflict. The person might want to reach out, but they hold themselves back because they don't feel worthy of receiving what they want. In their mind, the craving is a reminder of something they can't have, and so they suppress the impulse to act. Another element at play here is the concept of control. People often crave what they can't have, and in some cases, the act of craving becomes a way to maintain control over their emotional experience. If they don't act, they retain control over their feelings because they are not exposing themselves to the potential risks associated with taking action. By keeping their craving contained within themselves, they preserve the safety of the what-if scenario. If they act, they may risk losing that control and potentially facing disappointment or heartbreak. Therefore, the craving stays as an internal emotional experience rather than an external physical one. Sometimes, the person who craves you but remains silent might also be waiting for the right moment. They may feel that the current time is not ideal for expressing their feelings. Maybe they want to wait until they can offer you something more, emotional stability, security, or clarity about where they stand in the relationship. The desire is there, but they are trying to ensure that when they do act, it's the right time and that their feelings will be well received. They might not want to come across as impulsive or too eager, so they stay silent, hoping that the situation will align in a way that feels more natural or comfortable for them to act. In some cases, people might crave others but remain silent because they simply don't know how to express their feelings. Emotional expression is a skill that not everyone has learned. For some, the idea of articulating deep feelings, especially romantic ones, can be daunting. The fear of saying the wrong thing or of coming across as too forward or too vulnerable can paralyze them. Even though their emotional craving is strong, they lack the tools to express it in a way that feels comfortable to them. The key takeaway here is that craving does not automatically lead to action. The emotional intensity of craving is not always matched by the ability to act on it. Internal conflicts such as fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability, issues of self-esteem, and a desire to maintain control can prevent someone from moving forward. Craving is powerful, but it's often complicated. And when you find yourself in a situation where someone craves you but remains silent, it's important to understand that their silence is not a reflection of disinterest. It's likely a reflection of the complexity of their own emotions and the struggles they are facing in trying to figure out how, when, and whether to act on those feelings. The fear of rejection is one of the most powerful and universal fears that humans experience. It's a fear that holds us back, prevents us from taking risks, and often causes us to remain silent even when we crave connection or intimacy with someone. This fear is deeply ingrained in our psychological makeup and is rooted in the way our minds and emotions have evolved to protect us from harm. When someone craves you but remains silent, there's often an underlying fear of rejection that is at the heart of their silence. This fear can be so strong that it can overshadow even the most intense emotions, keeping someone from taking the steps needed to communicate those feelings. Rejection is painful. It can strike at the core of our self-worth, leaving us questioning our value and wondering why we weren't good enough. The prospect of being rejected, whether it's in a romantic context, a social context, or even a professional one, can trigger a flood of negative emotions. People often internalize rejection, believing that the act of being turned away is a reflection of their own inadequacy or failure. This fear of personal failure becomes so overwhelming that it paralyzes us, keeping us from expressing our true feelings. When someone craves you, yet remains silent, they may be protecting themselves from the pain they anticipate feeling if you don't reciprocate their feelings. The craving is real, but the fear of experiencing rejection is even more powerful. And so, silence becomes their defense mechanism. This fear is often rooted in past experiences. People who have been rejected or hurt in the past, whether in previous relationships, friendships, or even family dynamics, can develop a heightened sensitivity to the possibility of future rejection. These past emotional wounds can leave scars that make the thought of vulnerability even more terrifying. The person who craves you but is silent might have experienced rejection in a similar situation before, and that experience is influencing their behavior now. The emotional pain from past rejection can be so vivid that it feels as though the person is reliving that experience every time they face the possibility of being rejected again. This fear creates a barrier that prevents them from acting on their feelings, even though they might desperately want to. In many cases, this fear of rejection can stem from a lack of self-confidence or low self-esteem. When someone doesn't feel good enough or worthy of love or affection, they are more likely to fear rejection because they believe they won't be accepted or appreciated. The craving is there. The desire for connection is real, but the person doesn't feel confident enough to put themselves out there. They fear that no matter how strong their feelings are, they will never measure up to the other person's standards or expectations. This sense of inadequacy can cause them to retreat into silence, not because they don't care, but because they believe they are unworthy of receiving love in return. Additionally, there is the fear of emotional exposure. Vulnerability is a cornerstone of emotional connection, but it is also something that many people struggle with. The fear of being vulnerable, of exposing one's true self, desires, and feelings can make rejection feel even more daunting. To open up about how deeply you feel for someone is to expose your inner world, and the fear of having that world rejected is incredibly powerful. For some, the idea of putting themselves in a position where they are emotionally exposed can feel like a threat to their emotional safety. If they are rejected after being vulnerable, it can feel like a personal attack, a judgment of who they are at the core. This fear of emotional injury can keep someone silent even when their emotions are screaming for expression. They may crave you, but they hold back because the risk of being emotionally vulnerable is simply too great. This fear of rejection can also be linked to the desire for control. When someone is silent about their feelings, they maintain control over the situation. They can keep the emotional status quo intact, avoiding the possibility of vulnerability or the unknown. If they don't put their feelings out there, they don't have to face the risk of being rejected. They are still in control of the narrative, still in control of how they are perceived, and that gives them a sense of security. But of course, this sense of control comes at the expense of connection. The craving they feel for the other person might remain unspoken, but it's also locked within them, unable to grow into something deeper. Ironically, this attempt at control actually keeps them stuck, unable to move forward and experience the kind of emotional intimacy they crave. Another important factor to consider is the fear of rejection in the context of how the other person might view them. This is particularly true in romantic relationships or situations where there is a desire for deeper connection. The person who craves you but remains silent may fear that expressing their feelings will change how you see them. They might worry that you'll think less of them, that you'll find them too eager, too desperate, or too forward. This fear of being judged or rejected for being too much can be paralyzing. It's not just the fear of rejection itself that holds them back, but also the fear of how their emotions might impact the dynamic between them and the other person. They might crave closeness, but the fear of how that craving will be perceived by you is enough to keep them from acting. What often happens in these situations is that the fear of rejection becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more someone holds back because they fear rejection, the less likely they are to ever receive the response they crave. This can lead to a cycle of emotional frustration where the person continues to crave connection, but their silence only deepens the distance between them and the person they desire. The longer they remain silent, the more the gap between their desire and the reality of the relationship grows. In their mind, they are protecting themselves from the potential hurt of rejection, but in doing so, they miss out on the possibility of a deeper connection. The fear of rejection is a powerful force, but it's important to recognize that it's not something that needs to control us. If you find yourself in a situation where someone craves you but remains silent, try to understand that their silence is not a reflection of a lack of interest or affection. It's more likely that their fear of rejection is keeping them from expressing what they feel. In these moments, the best thing you can do is create an environment where vulnerability is safe, where openness and honesty are encouraged, and where the person can feel comfortable enough to express their true feelings without fear of judgment or rejection. Only then can the silence begin to break and the emotional connection can grow into something more. The role of self-esteem and self-worth in relationships cannot be overstated. These internal factors play a significant role in how individuals approach their desires, fears, and actions in the context of intimacy and connection. When someone craves you but remains silent, often their own internal struggles with self-esteem and self-worth are at play. At the core of this silence is an internal battle over whether or not they feel deserving of your attention, affection, and love. This feeling of not being good enough is a powerful force that can cause someone to hold back their emotions, even when they deeply crave the closeness of another person. Self-esteem is the foundation of how we perceive ourselves in the world and in relationships. When someone lacks self-confidence, they often believe that their needs or desires are unworthy of attention or validation. The person who craves you but remains silent might feel as though they are unworthy of reciprocation, even though they desire it deeply. This belief might stem from their past experiences, their upbringing, or even the societal standards they feel pressured to meet. They might feel that they fall short of some ideal, whether it's in terms of looks, personality, or emotional availability, and as a result, they hesitate to express what they feel because they don't believe they are worthy of receiving love or attention in return. This internal dialogue often manifests as self-doubt and insecurity. If someone craves you but is afraid to communicate that desire, they might be plagued by thoughts like, what if they don't feel the same way? Or what if I'm not enough for them? These thoughts are not only limiting, but also deeply damaging to one's sense of self. The more someone questions their own worth, the more likely they are to hold themselves back in relationships. They might remain silent because the fear of rejection is amplified by their own belief that they are not deserving of the love or affection they crave. Their silence becomes a protective mechanism against what they perceive as inevitable disappointment. Low self-esteem could also cause someone to misinterpret the situation, leading them to believe that the person they desire is out of their league or simply not interested in them. This belief can make them feel small and inadequate, and they may not have the courage to act on their feelings because they don't believe they stand a chance. In these moments, the craving becomes a painful reminder of what they feel they cannot have. They may long for your attention but remain silent, not because they don't care, but because they feel they are not worthy of receiving it. The craving exists, but their inner dialogue of inadequacy prevents them from acting on it. Moreover, people with low self-esteem often fear that expressing their desires will make them appear vulnerable or dependent. Vulnerability requires a level of self-assurance that someone struggling with low self-esteem may not have. They might fear that if they open up and express their emotions, it will come across as needy, insecure, or overwhelming. This fear can be paralyzing. They might crave intimacy, but the thought of exposing themselves emotionally is too much to bear. It's not just the fear of rejection, it's the fear of revealing too much of themselves, of showing their weaknesses, and of potentially being judged or criticized. So they retreat into silence, locking away their feelings rather than taking the risk of being emotionally exposed. In addition to this, there's the issue of comparison. When someone's self-worth is fragile, they are often hyper-aware of how they measure up against others. They might look at the person they desire and think, they can do better than me, or they deserve someone who is more confident, more accomplished, or more attractive. This sense of comparison is incredibly damaging to their self-esteem and creates a mental barrier that prevents them from pursuing the relationship they desire. The craving remains, but it's overshadowed by a belief that they are not worthy of the kind of connection they long for. The fear of falling short, of being judged, or of being rejected for who they are holds them back from expressing their desires, even though the craving for connection is still strong. At the same time, someone with low self-esteem might have a fear of being dependent or being seen as too emotionally reliant on another person. In a relationship, there's often a balancing act between giving and receiving, but for someone who struggles with self-worth, the idea of depending on someone else can feel like a threat to their independence and self-sufficiency. They might crave the emotional intimacy and connection that comes with a relationship, but they are afraid that expressing those desires will make them seem weak or needy. This internal conflict keeps them silent, even when the craving to connect is overwhelming. There is also the influence of past experiences, particularly past relationships, on someone's current self-esteem and behavior. If someone has been in a relationship where they felt unimportant, unheard, or undervalued, it can leave a lasting mark on their self-worth. These past emotional wounds can cause someone to fear future rejection, and as a result, They might internalize the idea that they are not deserving of a healthy, loving connection. This can lead them to avoid taking risks in new relationships, even if they deeply crave intimacy. The fear of repeating past mistakes or being hurt again can make someone retreat into silence, keeping their feelings bottled up rather than taking the chance of putting themselves out there. It's also worth noting that people with low self-esteem often struggle to assert their needs in relationships. If they don't believe they deserve love or attention, they may suppress their desires in favor of accommodating the other person's needs. This pattern of self-neglect can prevent them from seeking out the connection they crave. They may silently wish for closeness, but believe that expressing these desires is selfish or inappropriate. They may feel as though they are taking up too much space by expressing their needs, and that it's better to remain silent than risk inconveniencing someone else. The key to breaking this silence lies in understanding that self-worth can be developed and strengthened. It's crucial for someone who is struggling with low self-esteem to recognize that their feelings are valid and that they deserve to be loved and appreciated for who they are. Building self-worth involves challenging negative beliefs about oneself, seeking validation from within rather than from others, and learning to communicate openly and honestly about desires and needs. When someone starts to embrace their own value, they become more likely to express the craving they feel for connection, rather than letting it remain silent and unspoken. If you find yourself in a situation where someone craves you but remains silent due to their own struggles with self-esteem, it's important to be patient and understanding. The silence is not a reflection of a lack of interest, but rather a reflection of their internal struggles. By creating an environment of trust and security where they feel accepted for who they are, you can help them move beyond their fear and embrace the vulnerability that is necessary for true connection. Encouraging open communication and fostering a supportive atmosphere can help them feel valued and worthy of the affection they crave, allowing them to break free from the silence and express their true feelings.